Bénouville, Normandy. Midnight, June 6, 1944. Over the dark waters of the English Channel, 3 Halifax bombers thunder low above the English Channel, each straining against the weight of a Horsa glider tugging at its tail. Inside those silent wooden aircraft, 90 British infantrymen sit shoulder to shoulder, their rifles between their knees, their nerves masked by bursts of rowdy drinking songs. They sing not because they are merry, but because fear is creeping in. Private Harry Clark would later say, "This was different from any training flight. We knew there was no turning back." At the controls of the lead glider, Staff Sergeant Jim Walwork wipes sweat from his brow, eyes darting between the stopwatch in his hand and the black void ahead. His mission is simple, yet almost impossible. Land within yards of a German-held bridge, without lights, without engines, without a second chance. The target? 2 crossings east of the French town of Caen, one over the Orne River, the other over the Caen Canal. If the Germans hold them, they could cut off the entire Allied landing force at Sword Beach. If the British seize them, they will anchor the flank of the greatest invasion in history. Walwork checks his bearings. In seconds, the tow rope snaps free. The bomber's engine roar fades, and the only sound is the groan of air rushing past plywood wings. The men inside fall silent. The moment has come. The target awaiting those gliders was no ordinary crossing. At Bénouville, a steel swing bridge spanned the Caen Canal. This crossing would become known as Pegasus Bridge. Just a half-mile east, at Ranville, another pivoting bridge crossed the Orne River, later called Horsa Bridge. Together, these 2 spans were the only direct route for German reinforcements, especially tanks, to surge toward Sword Beach, where British forces would be landing within hours. If the Germans demolished Pegasus or Horsa Bridge, the British 6th Airborne Division would be stranded east of the Orne, cut off from the beaches. If they held them, German armor could pour through and drive straight into the Allied flank, threatening to crush the invasion before it began. To the planners of Operation Overlord, Pegasus Bridge and Horsa Bridge were the keys to the eastern flank and to D-Day itself. The mission to take them intact was codenamed Operation Deadstick, entrusted to fewer than 200 men under Major John Howard. Their orders were stark: land in total darkness, storm both bridges before the Germans could react, and hold them at all costs until reinforcements arrived. Even among Allied commanders, doubts clouded the plan. Air Chief Marshal Lee Mallory predicted that half the paratroopers and a third of the gliders would be lost before even reaching the ground. But without this desperate gamble, the entire Normandy landings would be exposed. So, as the Horsas cut free from their Halifax bombers and glided silently toward the French coast, the fate of D-Day hung on the capture of Pegasus Bridge and Horsa Bridge. Just after midnight, June 6, 1944, the first Horsa glider cut loose from its Halifax bomber. Inside, Staff Sergeant Jim Walwork and his co-pilot, John Ainsworth, strained against the controls. They had just one chance land within yards of Pegasus Bridge, in complete darkness, without engines, without instruments. A single mistake could kill every man aboard. As the glider descended, the silence was suffocating. The soldiers inside, who had been singing minutes earlier, fell quiet. They braced for impact, gripping their rifles and packs. Major John Howard, leading the mission, glanced at the young pilot and never forgot the sight, sweat pouring off his face like footballs, as Walwork wrestled the heavy craft through the night air. Then came the crash. The Horsa slammed into the field beside the canal with a deafening roar, skidding through barbed wire before coming to rest a mere 150 feet from Pegasus Bridge. The impact knocked every man unconscious for a moment. Walwork and Ainsworth were hurled through the cockpit glass, bloodied but alive. When Howard's men staggered to their feet, they were stunned against all odds. They had landed almost on top of their objective. The door flew open. Lieutenant Den Brotheridge shouted, "Gun out!" and sprinted toward the bridge with his platoon. The Germans, completely taken by surprise, barely had time to react. A sentry fired a flare into the sky, but it was too late. The British were already rushing across the span. Private Billy Gray cut down one startled defender with his Bren gun. Wally Parr stormed a bunker, tossing in a grenade before emptying his Sten into the survivors. The crack of rifles and the thunder of grenades echoed in the night as the glider troops fought hand-to-hand through trenches and pillboxes. In seconds, the British had seized the eastern end of Pegasus Bridge. But in the chaos, tragedy struck. Brotheridge, leading from the front, was hit in the neck by a burst of fire. He collapsed on the roadway, choking as his men secured the far side. Within 30 seconds of the first shots of D-Day, Lieutenant Den Brotheridge became the first Allied soldier killed in action on the invasion. Meanwhile, more gliders crash-landed hard in the surrounding fields, disgorging platoons who charged like unleashed hounds into the fight. Despite wrecks, injuries, and confusion, Howard's men fought with ferocity. Explosives were found wired to the bridge, but the Germans had not yet set charges. The engineers moved quickly, securing the girders and ensuring Pegasus Bridge remained intact. By the time the 3rd Glider's troops stormed in, the Germans were in full retreat. In less than 10 minutes, Major Howard's company had done the impossible. They had seized Pegasus Bridge intact. The capture of Pegasus Bridge had been swift, but Major Howard and his men knew the real battle was only beginning. The Germans would not leave such a vital crossing in British hands without a fight. Just after 2 a.m., ominous sounds rolled through the night, the grind of tank tracks on the road toward Benouville. Lieutenant Dennis Fox and his platoon dug in near the village church, strained their ears. "My God," muttered one officer, "what are we going to do with tanks coming down the road?" The Oxen Bucks had just one P-8 anti-tank launcher and little hope against armor, but Sergeant Charles Wagger Thornton refused to back down. Creeping dangerously close, he aimed the P-8 at the shadow of the lead vehicle. His hands trembled as he squeezed the trigger, and a fireball erupted as the round smashed into its target. The German tank went up in flames, ammunition cooking off inside. The road was blocked. For miles around, the glow of the inferno lit the night sky, and Howard's men crouched in disbelief. Thornton had stopped the first German counterattack with a single, miraculous shot. Elsewhere, at the Orne River crossing, soon known as Horsa Bridge, Lieutenant Todd Sweeney's platoon held off German probes in the dark. In one clash, they ambushed a half-track and captured an unexpected prize, Major Hans Schmidt, the furious German commander of the bridge defenses. Wounded and humiliated, Schmidt raged at his captors, declaring that the Allies would be driven back into the sea. His words carried little weight. His capture crippled German coordination in the area. By dawn, snipers began to plague the bridge. Every step into the open was a gamble, and British soldiers fell to unseen riflemen firing from rooftops and hedgerows. One medic was struck while tending a wounded man, and another paratrooper begged to be put out of his misery after being hit in the spine. The cost of holding Pegasus grew with every passing hour. Yet Howard's men refused to yield. Improvising with captured German weapons, they even turned an enemy anti-tank gun against approaching river traffic. Private Wally Parr, grinning behind the sights, blasted a gunboat on the canal until it veered into the bank, its crew captured. "We'll fire at anything that moves," Parr joked grimly, drilling holes in water towers and buildings where snipers might hide. The British line bent but did not break. Against tanks, snipers, and counterattacks, the men of D Company clung to Pegasus Bridge, waiting desperately for relief from the beaches. As dawn broke over Normandy, Pegasus Bridge was a scene of devastation. The quiet village of Benouville had been ripped apart by hours of firefights, explosions, and sniper fire. Burnt-out gliders littered the fields, their plywood frames splintered and smoking. The air reeked of cordite and burning fuel. Craters scarred the roadway, shattered buildings smoldered, and the steel girders of the bridge itself were pocked with bullet holes and grenade scars. Howard's men clung to their positions, but the cost was mounting. Medics scrambled through bursts of gunfire to drag the wounded to cover. Some men lay groaning in roadside ditches, clutching shattered limbs, while others lay still where they had fallen. Every open step risked a sniper's bullet. Lieutenant Sandy Smith, already wounded by shrapnel, watched helplessly as his orderly was shot dead beside him. The fighting was relentless, the pressure unceasing. German probes came from the north and west, supported by mortars and machine guns. Smoke drifted across the canal as British defenders fired at every flash, every shadow. At times, it was impossible to tell who was alive and who wasn't. Pegasus Bridge, seized in minutes, was now being held by sheer grit through hours of chaos and carnage. By late morning, the men of D Company were near breaking point. They were low on ammunition, their dead and wounded lay all around, and the air still echoed with the snap of rifles from hidden German sharpshooters. Howard knew they could not hold much longer without reinforcements. And yet, against all odds, the bridge still stood in British hands. The battered survivors of D Company had done what many thought impossible. They had taken Pegasus Bridge and they were refusing to let it go. By mid-morning on June 6th, the men of D Company were exhausted. They had stormed and held Pegasus Bridge against repeated German probes, but their numbers were thin, their ammunition running low, and sniper fire continued to cut down men in the open. Major John Howard knew they could not last forever. Then, just after 1 p.m., the sound of bagpipes floated across the fields. At first, the airborne troops thought it was madness music in the middle of battle, but it was no hallucination. Marching at the head of a column of commandos was Lord Lovat, commander of the 1st Special Service Brigade, striding calmly in full kit, followed by his personal piper, Bill Millen, who played blue bonnets over the border as bullets snapped around them. The sight was surreal. To Howard's weary men, it was also salvation. Lovat's commandos had fought their way inland from Sword Beach to reinforce the 6th Airborne, securing the bridge and the flank of the invasion. Amid gunfire and mortar blasts, Lovat shook Howard's hand. "John," he said simply, "today history is being made." He was right. By nightfall, both Pegasus Bridge and Horsa Bridge were firmly in Allied hands. The bridges had not been destroyed, the eastern flank of the Normandy invasion was secure, and the path inland from Sword Beach remained open. For Howard's men, the price had been high. Lieutenant Den Brotheridge, killed within seconds of the assault, became the first Allied soldier to die in action on D-Day. Others would fall to snipers, mortars, and counterattacks before the day was over. Yet their sacrifice ensured the success of the greatest amphibious invasion in history. In the days that followed, the bridge at Bénouville was given a new name, Pegasus Bridge, after the winged horse insignia of the British 6th Airborne Division. It stood not just as a crossing over the Caen Canal, but as a symbol of precision, daring, and courage. Air Chief Marshal Lee Mallory, once a skeptic, later called the glider landings at Pegasus Bridge the greatest feat of flying in the war. Against impossible odds, fewer than 200 men had changed the course of D-Day, and with it, the fate of Europe.